On the night of the 12th of June, 1944, just 6 days after the Allied invasion of France, British anti-aircraft observers heard an unusual noise in the sky. The loud droning buzz came from a small cross-shaped aeroplane trailing a tail of fire. Travelling fast, it seemed to be heading for London. Those watchers did not know, but they were looking at the first manifestation of a new kind of warfare. The tide of war had turned against the Nazis, and Hitler looked to desperate measures to strike back at the Allies. The strange flying bomb was just the first of his vengeance weapons. Soon another, even more terrifying threat, the ballistic rocket, was to menace Allied cities. As Allied armies closed inexorably on the borders of the Reich, Hitler and his followers began to pin their hopes upon two new wonder weapons. The V-1 was a pilotless flying bomb, known to the Allies as the Doodlebug or Buzz bomb. It carried a heavy warhead and was designed to strike at targets from a range of more than 200 kilometers. The Luftwaffe's planners felt that it would be all but impossible to stop. They were wrong. But the V-1 was soon joined by another weapon, against which defenses were powerless. On the 8th of September 1944, Chiswick in West London was rocked by a mysterious explosion. Over the next few weeks, it became apparent that the Buzz bomb was not the only new vengeance weapon. The long-range ballistic missile had arrived in the form of the hypersonic V-2. Germany was rocket mad in the years after World War I. Pioneers experimented with rocket-powered cars and gliders. But it was the idea of firing rockets into space which really caught the imagination. The early inspiration was provided by Hermann Oberth, a mathematics teacher who developed an interest in rockets in his 20s. In 1923, he published a vastly influential paper, The Rocket into Interplanetary Space, which explored the possibilities of large missiles. Oberth's work was used by film director Fritz Lang for the film Frau im Mond. Oberth persuaded Lang to fund the development of a real rocket which would be fired on the day the movie premiered. The plans came to nothing. The movie flopped. But it gave Oberth the funds to continue his rocket research. He formed the Verein für Raumschifffahrt, the Society for Space Travel, and went looking for new backers. Oberth found them in the army. Under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was forbidden the development of long-range artillery, but the treaty said nothing about rockets. Oberst Karl Becker, chief of the Army Weapons Board, was familiar with the pioneering work of Hermann Oberth and felt that there might be scope for development in military rocketry. Becker provided funding and facilities, and by 1930 a research establishment had been set up near Berlin. Known as the Raketenflugplatz, or rocket port, it saw the first unsuccessful launch in May 1931. Becker had been joined by Captain Walter Dornberger, and the two army officers persuaded the General Staff to fund an army liquid rocket program. Becker's first step was to recruit 20-year-old Werner von Braun. Von Braun, a Prussian aristocrat, had become fascinated by rockets at an early age, and as a teenager had joined the Society for Space Travel. Von Braun was appointed the civilian head of the Army rocket program set up at the Kummersdorf Artillery Proving Ground, about 100 kilometers south of Berlin. The first rocket, dubbed Aggregate 1, or A1, was launched in 1933. According to von Braun, it took us 6 months to build and half a second to blow up. The improved A2 flew in December 1934 and reached an altitude of around 2,000 meters. In March 1936, Dornberger and von Braun were ready to proceed with a much more powerful rocket, the A3. Larger and more powerful than the A2, it would also need much more space than was available at Kummersdorf. It was designed to be a precursor to the A4, which would be an operational military rocket. The German military decided to construct a massive new test facility at Peenemünde on Usedom Island in the Baltic. Lying almost due north of Berlin, Peenemünde was an ideal rocket test site. It was sparsely populated and had plenty of room for construction. Rockets could travel for over 400 kilometers over the Baltic, falling harmlessly into the sea at the end of the test. The Luftwaffe was also looking for a new test range to develop its own projects and agreed to share the cost of construction with the Army. The Air Force would be allocated the western section, while the Army would have the much larger eastern part. The job of building the massive site and all its associated support and test facilities was entrusted to the Luftwaffe. In the unbelievably short space of a year, a whole new town was erected, complete with design and assembly buildings, laboratories, rocket test rigs, its own network of roads, a railway, as well as shops, a radio station, and even a hair salon. By April 1937, German rocket scientists were able to move from their cramped quarters at Kummersdorf into the new facility. The first A3 missile was fired in December 1937. It failed. So did the next two launches. Clearly something was wrong, something which would have to be put right before the military began to lose interest in rocketry. In the meantime, the A4 project was put on hold. The design and development of a new rocket to replace the A3 was perfected at Peenemünde. One thing which was lacking at Kummersdorf, but now available at Peenemünde, was a supersonic wind tunnel. This proved invaluable in refining the basic aerodynamic shape of the rocket, in particular its tail section, in which the all-important guidance unit was contained. Designated A5, the new rocket resembled the A3 in overall size, but featured a larger diameter fuselage. Internally, the most important improvement was an entirely new control system. As the Germans planned to test many A5s, a production line was set up to assemble the rockets. Testing of the A5 was carried out at a new facility constructed on a small island north of Peenemünde. In some instances, painted red and yellow to aid visual tracking, the rockets were put into a crate and shipped across to the island while important personnel such as von Braun flew in. Tests of the A5 began in mid-1938. There were of course the odd failures, but by and large the A5s performed well. So well, in fact, that some rockets were used repeatedly after retrieval from the Baltic. Tests were even carried out of air-launched A5s dropped from Heinkel bombers. Over a period of 2 years, more than 24 A5s were fired. The improved guidance system worked perfectly, and the final version managed to reach an altitude of over 12 kilometers. The resounding success of the A5 rekindled the interest of the German military. In late 1938, the German Army High Command ordered full-scale development of the A4. The challenging specification called for a rocket which could deliver a ton of high explosive over a distance of 250 kilometers. The task of engineering a scaled-up A5 as a viable military rocket was daunting, to say the least. Whereas the test rocket had weighed just over 1 ton, the A4 had a projected launch weight of around 12.5 tons. Where the original A3's engine produced about 1,500 kilograms of thrust, the A4's engine would need to deliver over 25 tons. The rocket was a steel framework, externally clad in riveted steel plate. Lighter materials were available, but they would not have survived the massive aerodynamic and gravitational forces of hypersonic flight. The shape of the missiles was reputedly based on that of the German Army's 7.92mm rifle bullet, which was known to be ballistically stable at supersonic speeds. Power would be provided by burning a mixture of alcohol and liquid oxygen. The rocket carried over 5 tons of alcohol and 4 tons of oxygen, enough for around 70 seconds of powered flight. By this time, it would be traveling at over 5,500 kilometers an hour and would have reached a maximum altitude of around 90 kilometers. The A4 needed a lot of fuel, over 100 kilograms per second. It was driven into the combustion chamber by a lightweight steam turbine powered by the explosive reaction of hydrogen peroxide and calcium permanganate. Guidance and control of the missile presented even greater difficulties than the rocket motor. Keeping a rocket upright at launch is like balancing a stick in your hand. You have to be able to sense any changes in balance and apply a corrective movement to keep it stable. Gyroscopes were used to detect any changes in attitude. They acted as directors to carbon vanes projecting into the rocket exhaust. Actuated by hydraulic servos, these vanes vectored the rocket's thrust, providing low-speed control. At higher speeds, the missile was controlled and stabilized by the movable tail surfaces. Although simple in theory, the control system had to react instantly to cope with gusting winds on launch. It had to tilt the missile to the correct angle so that its ballistic flight path would take it to the target. Autopilots of the day were primitive, so the development team created one of the world's first analog computers to handle guidance. It was not without its problems, however, and the first V2s were fitted with an unsatisfactory interim autopilot. Development of the A4 was now affected by external events. In September 1939, war broke out. German troops swiftly overran Poland. 7 months later, most of Western Europe was occupied. The success of the Wehrmacht convinced Hitler that current German weaponry was more than adequate to deter possible enemies in the foreseeable future. As a result, he ordered that all research work into advanced weapons, including jets and rockets, was to cease. Although no longer a priority, development of the A4 continued, albeit at a slower pace. The engine was completed and tested. Further A3 and A5 flights were made, and the first examples of the A4 were being hand-built. By this time, military control of the A4 program had passed from Becker to Dornberger. He had to fight numerous political battles to keep development funding. There was also political opposition from Fritz Todt, Minister for Armaments. In February 1942, Todt died in a plane crash. He was succeeded by Albert Speer, who was more favorably disposed towards advanced weapons. The first A4 was launched on the 13th of June 1942. It was a failure. A second launch in August also ended in failure. The first successful launch took place on the 3rd of October 1942, when the test vehicle lifted off successfully and flew 190 kilometers out into the Baltic. While not reaching its peak performance, this was the first powered vehicle to travel faster than sound. This footage is from a film shown to the Führer to convince him of the rocket's viability. The caption in German reads, "We have done it." The first Allied bombing raids against German cities had already taken place, and Hitler demanded retaliation. He saw the A4 as the perfect vengeance weapon. Soon the A4 was reaching its designed maximum speed of over 5,000 kilometers per hour and flying to the edge of space. But it was not the only vengeance weapon being tested at Peenemünde. The Luftwaffe too had a project. Although development started long after the rockets, the V1 flying bomb would be thrown into action first. In 1942, Generalfeldmarschall Erhard Milch, the Secretary of State for Air, visited the German Army Research Institute at Peenemünde. He was there to see a demonstration firing of A-3 and A-5 missiles. Milch did not like the fact that the army was making such progress in developing long-range weaponry. He issued a requirement for a rival long-range weapon for the Luftwaffe. An expendable unmanned aircraft would be quickest and easiest to develop. Gerhard Fiesler-Werke of Kassel drew up rough designs to fulfill the requirement. Fiesler's scheme was based upon use of the Argus AS-014 pulse jet unit for propulsion. The pulse jet was a very simple concept. Air from the intake passed through one-way valves, mixed with fuel and ignited. The explosion closed the valves and burst out of the rear of the stovepipe. Once the pressure dropped, the valves could open. The whole sequence repeated itself several times per second. The Fiesler proposal was known as the FI-103. It was accepted by the Luftwaffe High Command, and a team under former Heinkel engineer Robert Lusser started on the design of the fuselage and control system. A development team was immediately established at Peenemünde. Its leader, Engineer Temmer, was given far-reaching powers to conscript whatever manpower or equipment he considered necessary. The result was a small, pilotless aircraft with a wingspan of just over 5 meters. The Argus pulse jet was mounted above the rear of the fuselage. Simplicity was the key. The Luftwaffe stipulated that the flying bomb had to be easy to assemble and to maintain, and to use the minimum number of parts. The missile had a small windmill in the nose, which powered an airlog. This measured the distance traveled, and at a predetermined distance, cut off the fuel to the engine. It also commanded the weapon to dive. The airlog gave erratic and imprecise measurements. However, it was to prove accurate enough to hit a target the size of London. Section E8 at Peenemünde was tasked with designing the launch gear, support vehicles, and other ancillary equipment. The launch gear was important, since the pulse jet engine needed to be at flying speed before it would work. To get the missile into the air, it was catapulted along an inclined ramp by a chemically powered piston. It took less than a month to progress from the first glide test to the first powered ramp launch, which took place on Christmas Eve, 1942.
Achtung! Abschluss!
Over the next months, many missiles were launched, some even reaching the south coast of Sweden. In July 1943, one missile managed to hit within 800 meters of its designated target, more than 200 kilometers from launch. While the flying bomb program was progressing smoothly and at a great rate, the rocket team was still having difficulty. The initial phases of flight trials indicated that the A4 had low speed stability problems. This was particularly dangerous at launch, since even without a warhead, the mixture of alcohol, oxygen and chemicals was a bomb waiting to go off. Numerous spectacular accidents occurred at the A4 test stands. Problems with the stability and flight control systems continued through 1943. Some faults were the result of pushing technology to the limit, others were traced to faulty workmanship. But each disaster taught a little more, and slowly the A4 was evolving into a practical weapon. Official approval of the V weapon program was reflected in the number of important visitors to Peenemünde. April 1943 saw the first visit of Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler to the site. The SS leader now showed considerable interest in the rockets, and he came again on the 29th of June. Dornberger gave the Reichsführer the full tour, explaining the operation of the A4's engine. Although there were many successful launches, things would still occasionally go drastically wrong. Watched by Himmler and his entourage, the 38th missile was launched from Test Stand 7. It deviated from its flight path after liftoff and crashed to Earth after just 27 seconds, smashing into Karlshagen airfield only 3 kilometers away. Although it did not carry a warhead, exploding fuel dug a large crater and damaged several aircraft. The activity at Peenemünde did not go unnoticed by the Allies. When an early V-1 was identified on a reconnaissance photograph, it was clear that this was not a normal research facility. And when V-2 rockets started appearing on the photos, the British knew that it was something special. On the night of August 17th, 18th, 1943, 560 RAF bombers hit Peenemünde in 3 waves. The raid killed over 700 people, including some important scientists and high command officers. But the raid failed to cause significant damage to the vital research laboratories due to their dispersed nature. Now that the location of the research site had been compromised, Himmler suggested that further trials of A4s should be carried out at a former Polish army reservation near Blizna in Poland, under the auspices of the SS. More than 100 missiles were eventually to be fired from the launch site at Blizna, 10 being fired on a single day. Himmler also suggested that production be moved to a secure manufacturing site, making use of concentration camp inmates as slave labor. Pilot production of the A4 missile had started in a new factory just south of Peenemünde early in 1943. At the same time, the Fiesler company had completed around 300 flying bombs. Now production of both the V1 and the V2 was transferred to the Mittelwerke in the Harz Mountains and the Brunswerke at Stettin. The underground Mittelwerke factory near Nordhausen had been set up to make use of slave labor from the Dora Mittelbau concentration camp. Once fully online, it was expected to deliver 1,000 rockets per month, as well as a similar number of flying bombs. To achieve those figures, 30,000 slave workers were worked to death in just 19 months. The original plans for the Luftwaffe's Operation Rumpelkammer, the flying bomb assault on Britain, called for it to begin in December 1943. However, when further tests showed that the missile was far from reliable, primarily because of poor quality components, this had to be delayed. Nevertheless, an operational research unit was formed at Zempen on the Baltic coast. Under the command of Oberst Max Wachtel, this unit was to develop the techniques for using the V1 operationally. The operational research unit evolved into an active unit, Flak Regiment 155, with Wachtel remaining in command. At the same time, the High Command ordered the construction of 96 firing sites on the French coast between Cherbourg and Saint-Omer. However, the massive concrete launch structures could not fail to attract the attention of the Allies, and the RAF launched a series of devastating attacks on the huge unfinished structures. Following a period of intensive firing, the first operational V1 battery set off for France. But it was clear that there were too few qualified troops available for operations against Britain to commence on schedule. Operational control of the V1 was now with the 65th Army Corps. This had been created specifically to control long-range weaponry of both Luftwaffe and Army programs. Royal Air Force attacks on the French coastal launching sites were at the same time proceeding apace. By March 1944, only 14 sites out of the original 96 were operational. It seemed that Operation Rumpelkammer was doomed, but Section E8 of the Karlshagen establishment came to the rescue by developing an easily erected launching ramp. These structures were rushed to previously surveyed sites, usually in wooded areas where a minimum of camouflage was necessary. Low-scale production of the V2 was now going ahead. On the 9th of September 1943, von Braun announced that development work on the A4 missile was finished. The rocket became available in quantity in November, by which time the first army instructors had completed their own courses at Peenemünde. They, in turn, set up an Army A4 rocket school at Kesslen in Pomerania, not far from Peenemünde. By January 1944, the first firing troops were ready with their rockets at the Blitzner test range. Despite von Braun's confidence, the A4 was far from being ready for service. Many of the first batch of rockets exploded soon after launch. Others broke up in mid-air without exploding. Some of the failures were caused by poor quality components, but others were the result of deliberate sabotage by the slave laborers forced to construct these weapons. About 600 A4s were fired in troop training between January 1944 and February 1945, almost all of them on the Blitzner range. Had it been an Air Force weapon, the A4 might have been fired from fixed bases with masses of steel and concrete. This would have been a major error, as the V1 operators were to discover. Instead, the A4 was designed as a mobile weapon system, and the rocket itself was specially sized so that it could just pass through a railway tunnel mounted on a flat car. This was no easy decision, because such a fantastic weapon needed a whole army in support, including a large capacity source of liquid oxygen at a temperature of minus 183 degrees centigrade, large propellant loading systems, an unprecedented amount of delicate maintenance and adjustment, and guidance setting that call for laboratory conditions. Preparing the rocket for firing took 6 hours, but the mobile weapon system proved its worth. In spite of Allied command of the air, not one launch was prevented or interrupted by enemy air attack. Though A4 test firings had involved huge gantries positioned over concrete pads with massive installations for the propellants and many other services, the field troop had to carry everything with them. Transport of rockets and some other parts over long distances was usually on rail flat cars or in boxcars. And by December 1944, actual firings were being made from the same rail flat cars. At first, however, the firing troop carried with them a launch platform in the form of a welded steel circular table, standing just over 2 meters high. In its initial form, the A4 rocket system comprised up to 30 vehicles. These drove in convoy, normally by night, to pre-surveyed launch sites. From the start, it was accepted that the rocket was too big to hide or to camouflage, and there was little attempt to prevent detection from the air. The rockets themselves were normally carried on a Meilerwagen, a long steel lattice frame riding on 3 sets of pneumatic tires behind a large tractor vehicle. This Meilerwagen gripped the rocket in calipers, holding it firmly against soft pads. The transporter incorporated a giant hydraulic ram, usually powered from an external source, which slowly raised the complete cradle and missile vertically onto the launcher. The launch troop had to work their way through 2 substantial manuals of procedures, which in all took a minimum of 6 hours. There were over 180 checks and measures to be made of electrical items alone. The intensely cold liquid oxygen was transported from the nearest railhead to the launch site by a special tanker. The rocket's tanks were filled in the last 2 hours before launch. Last of all, and with the strictest adherence to procedures, the fluids needed to drive the turbo pump were loaded. Z-Stoff, calcium permanganate solution, T-Stoff, concentrated hydrogen peroxide. Once these were aboard, the A4 was regarded with the greatest respect. Nobody liked it if the day was windy, because a toppled-over missile invariably went up in a fireball, even if the simple electric contact fuse on the tip of the nose failed to hit the ground. Launch sites were carefully surveyed to give the exact geographical position essential to calculate the precise direction of the target. The sights were almost invariably in forest clearings to provide protection against air reconnaissance and to shelter the raised rocket from strong winds. The A4 was guided relatively simply, being aligned in the direction of the target. Gyros and accelerometers were fitted to gently tip the rocket into the required trajectory. These cut the main engine at the precise velocity to ensure that its ballistic path would carry it to the target. By the time of the launching, most of the vehicles and launch crew would have retired to a safe distance. Actual launch was initiated from armored vehicles or, more rarely, blockhouses in prepared sites.
Die Steuerung klar, ist klar. Das Triebwerk klar, ist klar. Schlüssel aufschießen. Schlüssel steht aufschießen. Durchschalten. Ist durchgeschaltet. Belüftung klar, Zündung klar, Vorstufe klar.
Occasionally the rocket would be fitted with radio telemetry systems so that the launch crew could monitor the first stages of the flight and check that the missile was on trajectory.
Hauptstufe! Hauptstufe gegeben! Stecker gefallen!
It was time for the V weapons to go to war. The V1 was first in action. By April 1944, Flak Regiment 155 was in place in France, but it was under strength. This caused delays in setting up launch sites. Things changed after June the 6th. V1s and all necessary supplies were rushed to the forward zones after the Allied landings in Normandy. The long-delayed operational debut came on the night of the 12th, 13th June. It was an inauspicious beginning. So many launch sites had been damaged that only 10 missiles were launched, of which 7 crashed. 3 days later, it was very different. On the night of the 15th, 16th June, 244 bombs were fired from 55 sites, and by the 21st of June, over 1,000 V1s had droned and buzzed their way towards England. Nobody who lived through the V weapon bombardment of 1944 could forget the loud throb of the approaching missile, the sudden silence as the engine cut out, and the tremendous explosion a few seconds later as the missile hit the ground. Missiles were also launched from the air by Heinkel bombers. Although numbers were not high, these were active for most of the second half of 1944. The start of the V1 campaign was seen as a major success by the Luftwaffe. Congratulations poured in from all quarters, even from officials who had previously opposed the scheme. In view of this change in fortune, Hitler himself approved the formation of 2 new V1 batteries. Allied air attacks on the sites themselves were not as successful as had been hoped. Attacks on supply routes were much more effective, and delivery of V1s to the launch sites fell short of the regiment's capacity for firing them. Even worse, British ground forces were pushing north out of the Normandy beachhead, capturing sites along the way. By the 1st of September 1944, Operation Rumpelkammer was over. In just over 2 months, more than 8,500 V1s had been launched. However, the V1 had never been as effective as the Germans believed. Fighter, anti-aircraft and balloon barrage defenses proved to be increasingly effective countermeasures. Just under half of the V1s crossing the coast were destroyed by aircraft or anti-aircraft fire, and many went astray, exploding in open country. Unfortunately, those which did get through were enough to kill 6,000 people, 5,000 in London alone. But if the V1 could be countered by conventional means, against the V2 there was no defense. The missile travels so fast that it arrived and exploded before the whooshing sound of its dive onto the target could be heard by its unfortunate victims. The first operational V-2 launches took place on the 6th of September, when 2 missiles were fired against Paris. 2 days later, the sustained campaign against London began. The early strikes were blamed on faulty gas mains, but within days the British government had to admit the truth. Over 1,300 rockets were launched, mostly from wooded sites near The Hague in Holland. Some were even launched from the city itself. This launch site was not far from the historic Palace of Peace in the center of the town. About 90% of the A4s actually reached the British Isles, killing nearly 3,000 people and causing considerable damage. Around 100 rockets blew up in flight or went astray as their guidance systems failed. One rocket actually went east instead of west, hitting the ground near Wiesbaden. Advancing Allied troops had forced the Germans back from the North Sea ports in Belgium and Holland. The German High Command decided to use the V weapons in an attempt to prevent the Allies from using these ports to resupply their forces. Pulling back to the Eifel Mountains, the V-1 launch sites were prepared for operations against Antwerp, Brussels and Liège. Starting on October the 21st, more than 8,000 V-1s were launched during the Belgian campaign. The damage they inflicted had little practical military effect. This was largely due to highly effective US Army radar-directed anti-aircraft guns, which accounted for 95% of the missiles fired. The V-2s also took part in the campaign. Over 1,300 were fired against Antwerp, causing considerable damage to the city, but doing little to disrupt the flow of supplies. A few V-1s with their range extended to 320 kilometers were fired against London during the early days of 1945, but activities were limited. V-2s continued to be launched against continental targets until the suspension of all reprisal weapon operations on the 27th of March. More than 30,000 V-1s were manufactured, and about 18,000 were fired or dropped in combat. Most of the remainder were destroyed in factories or in transit, though several hundred were found in underground factories at the end of the war. Over 4,000 V-2s, out of the near 10,000 produced, had been fired in anger. Ultimately, the V-weapons failed to provide Hitler with the vengeance he sought. They absorbed an enormous amount of Nazi Germany's resources while providing little military return for the huge investment. The V-1's potential was never really fulfilled. As so often happened under the Third Reich, personal feuds and inter-service rivalries meant that struggles for control were the norm. Senior commanders spent more time fighting each other than fighting the enemy. The V-2 was far more influential. One of the greatest single achievements in the history of rocketry, it was the foundation of all post-war missile development. The Soviets, who captured Peenemünde at the end of the war, forcibly recruited as many scientists as they could. They had great influence on Soviet missile development. American rocket programs were also given a massive boost by the German know-how. Many of the scientists were rounded up in an operation called Project Paperclip. They were sent across the Atlantic, where they provided the core of the teams which were to develop the first intercontinental ballistic missiles. It was the men behind the V-2, most notably Werner von Braun, who provided much of the early impetus for the American space program. In just over 2 decades, they would take man beyond Earth's atmosphere and place him on the moon.